Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to Black Spy Podcast, the show that lifts the light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
In my introductory episode, I explained what we intend to do. However, my producer, Jeff, said that what we should do is an explanatory episode so people can understand actually what this secret world is that we're speaking about.
For more than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.
Jeff, surprise me, ask me the questions you want, and I'll try and explain what the secret world is and my part in it.
Thank you for having me here, Carlton. It's great to have this opportunity to pick your brain as a total layman. The first thing that I wanted to ask you is, what is the most important thing that I need to know about you?
I guess it's my upbringing. So I was brought up to have a very strong work ethic. My father never had a day off when he was meant to be working, so that was kind of 35, 40 years. He even ran to work in the snow when the buses couldn't get there in the 60s and 70s, and that run would be about 10, 12 miles. So he was a guy who basically did his work, and my mother the same. So there's that aspect. I guess I'm a self-starter, which also comes from that process. And I've also believed in creativity. Clearly, I've got to be truthful, I like to succeed. So I guess those are sort of the behaviours which are brought up in me. And I think that everybody's got something to teach. And even if it's the guy who is, let's say, the tramp on the street, that guy's got something to teach her. If nothing else, how not to end up like him.
I'm curious. I and almost every other man out there, throughout our childhood, we were made aware of this idea of being a spy, and it's something that we fantasized about being. Yet, at some point, your path diverged, and you became a spy. So how did you do that? How did you go from birth to being a spy?
In a circuitous route, let's put it that way. When I was born in 1950s working class northwestern English mill town, we were the only black family in the area. The people who we called our grandparents were local people from the area, and their children would be uncles and aunties and stuff like that. That was great. So I saw that one side of it, people harmonious, if you will, altogether. But the other side of that coin was, if you went into a bigger city, you say Manchester, whatever, it was absolutely ubiquitous to see signs that said, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. The dogs and the Irish element were something that could be left on or left off, but it was always no blacks. Because I was one of the mid-50s, so the 60s to the 70s, the National Front was very big. You had Enoch Powell, and you had this idea of what was known in the UK as the colour bar. Now, I mention all of this because it never even crossed my mind to try and be in things like even the police, never mind anything else. I remember as a school kid studying A-levels, I remember saying to the careers individual in the fifth form, so before the A-levels, I'd like to be an army officer, not a private soldier, an officer, to which he kind of said, well, no, you should think about being a private and maybe do some sort of physical education in the army. That was the perspective. There were certain things you could do and certain things you couldn't do, and the colour bar was all powerful, to be truthful. I became a pretty good disc jockey, and Radio 1 had a colour bar, so you couldn't get in there. I was a good dancer, and the teacher who basically wished to put me forward to dance. I went to Manchester University for dance at one stage, not as a student, but pre-student. Because I was good, they brought me forward. And she had said, listen, I'm going to get you into my old alma mater, to my old school, London School of Dance down here. And then several weeks after, still in fifth form, I said, oh, what have you heard? And she was pretty much sheepish. And then she said, oh, they say you don't have the right body type. I said, oh, have you sent a photograph or something? She said, no. So you see, that was the colour bar. As soon as you mention who you are, you just couldn't get on. It was just one of those things. So you had to look at your areas. Now, football was one of the areas where you could get on. My father was a professional cricketer. He'd been in the Merchant Navy during the Second World War, all the way through the Battle of the Atlantic, shouldn't have survived in reality. And basically, Mr. Dunlops had seen him play cricket in about 1943, I think it was, and he got a ridiculous amount of people out for a very low score. And he provided him with a letter. Mr. Dunlops, my old man, didn't know who he was. He basically said, when the war's over, come over to England and we'll see what we can do for you. Basically, my dad forgot another 2 years of the war, then another couple of years sailing. He then one day found in his sea trunk this letter, so he sent it back off, and lo and behold, he gets a letter back basically saying, if you're as good as you were, come, here's a ticket to stay in the #1 hotel in Manchester, and you've got work with me, but you'll play cricket. So he took the chance and came over. So that's how he came over in about 49 for good. And then my mother followed subsequently. So sport was an area which you could do something in, and my old man was always pretty positive on that because that had been his outlet. And so when I was 16, the local team, 3rd division, tried to sign me. I've got to say, I didn't accept it. I said to him, no, I want to stay on and do my A-levels. And it could have been one of two things. One is the only black players that I knew were Clyde Best and Paul Reaney at that stage. And I guess Paul, most people didn't even know he was black. I guess he didn't know that either. And Clyde Best, well, he was putting the ball in West Ham. But it was something that was more of a dream. And after all, the 3rd division didn't pay much money. And if you broke your leg in those days, that was you finished. So I decided not to do that, and I went to the 6th form. So again, in my mind, nothing about spying or anything like that, or being in the police or anything. Even though one of the people who I called my uncles and cousins and stuff, one of them was in the police force in what was then Lancashire Police. And so I wasn't negative to that perspective, but I didn't understand what it was about it. And my interest wasn't in general police in any way. My only interest was in the secret world of intelligence and stuff like that. It should never have happened. And it happened just by chance. And I will explain about that probably in more depth at another time because it's quite a convoluted story.
So throughout this life that you've led, full of these incredible experiences that I'm sure the pot is brimming over with all of these experiences you've had, but what is one of your defining moments that you can tell us about now?
I guess sitting at the crossroads of history, there's a lot of things one can't speak about, but what I will say is I can remember when, just prior to the Afghan war, which is now just finished for us, I had written a paper at the time I was in SIS, which is the real name, Secret Intelligence Service, the real name of MI6, and I was a case officer there, which is basically, for want of a better description, the person who carries out the James Bond role, who actually carries out actions around the world. And I'd written a paper basically saying we should not get involved. Now, I knew that was on a hide into hell because politically, politicians wanted us to follow the Americans through. But I'd put my reasoning, and my reasoning was dead simple. 9/11 was not created to destroy the United States. It's a pinprick. Okay, 3,000 people lost their life. It's a lot of people, but it's a pinprick in reality of this world. What it was designed to do was to make the United States take big actions against Islamic terrorism. We'll call it Islamic terrorism. And so what bin Laden knew he had to do was, in a way, insult the United States in such a manner that it couldn't do anything but hit him back. Now, you can ask the question, why? The biggest threat to the type of Islam which is preached, jihadi Islam, by Al-Qaeda at the time and their various other organisations, is basically that the vast majority of Muslims are not interested. They basically want to go about their religion, some with greater depths of belief, some with lesser depth of belief, like a lapsed Catholic or not, but just get on with the place in where they live. So the Western Muslim, which was then, if you will, the window through which many other Muslims in the Eastern world looked because of the advantage they perceived the Western Muslim was having, basically just wanted a good life, like 99% of people do. That is an anathema, because what that actually does is it bites away at cause. What you want to do is give Muslims no choice. So you carry out an action which means that, as it would be perceived, Christians then say Muslims are no good, let's take action against them, and then the jihadis can say, this is a jihad against us. So it gives the Muslim no choice but to involve themselves, even if just empathetically, on the side of the jihadi. And that's what 9/11 was about. It was about creating that element. So the US, okay, are hit, and they say, we're going to make them pay, and they'll pay in Afghanistan for this because that's where bin Laden is. Now, I was working against various jihadi organisations, non-aligned jihadis as well as Hezbollah and others. And I had some contacts that we call agents. We tried to make it so the war wasn't necessary. I'm being cautious as I'm speaking because we've got a very virulent act in Britain. It's called the Official Secrets Act, and you don't want to transgress it in any way. So this is what I've written in my book. So I know that's covered because that book, it took 4 years to get it through. My book, by the way, is called Black Ops, The Incredible True Story of a British Secret Agent. And that took 4 years to get it through the British government and through British government lawyers, through lawyers from the Metropolitan Police Service and many other organisations, all of the intelligence and security agencies. So I've actually said this in the book, so I know I can say it now. now. So basically, that was me trying to change the world with another guy in tow, because he was my agent, to try and prevent us going to war in Afghanistan, which has lasted 20 years, caused a whole host of problems. Frankly, what's worth understanding is, the reason why I'm saying serve nothing, is you need to understand that the whole jihadi movement came about because the CIA wished to form a process of defeating the Soviet when they were in Afghanistan. Okay, so President Najibullah in Afghanistan was a communist. He invited in the Soviets, and I'm saying it as it is, not what the propaganda said, invited in the Soviets to bolster up his system. And in those days, if you went into Kabul before the fall of the Soviet Union, you would see women in miniskirts and going to university and so on and so forth, because it was a communist state. Now, yeah, in the areas, which were tribal Pashtun areas, you wouldn't see that. But if you were in the urbanized areas, women had a lot of freedom. The Taliban came in and prevented that. But by then, of course, we defeated the Soviets and there was no longer any interest in Afghanistan until 9/11. So it's that type of historical element that I've sat at the crossroads of. In this case, it was unsuccessful, but that's what I was about.
That's a hell of a burden to hold on to for you. It's such a responsibility. With that said, and saying previously in this conversation that you've always had an interest in that covert world, how did you choose this profession? What did that process look like?
As I said before, you'd get the full understanding in Black Ops because I got time to explain it and I explained how that happened. But basically, it grew out of chance, to be truthful. I told you before I was doing DJing. I couldn't get on Radio 1, but I went to Germany being a disc jockey. Now, you've got to understand that time the Cold War was in its full heights. We're talking 1977, 78. And the Americans had something like 750,000 people in fact, you count independents, over 1 million people in Germany, in the United States Air Force Europe and the United States Army Europe, and all the dependents, and Germany effectively was still quite occupied. So I went there DJing with the American forces originally, then doing something else, and I ended up DJing then in a German club. And there was one guy who basically always used to say, because I learned German very quickly, which was something, and he always used to say to me, you'd make a fantastic detective, because nobody would think, there are black Germans, but nobody would think that you are, most of them are lighter skin because they're mixed race. Nobody would think that you're a detective. You'd be fantastic. We should open a detective agency together, this guy said. Now, he was going to go to the Bundeswehr, which is the German army, which you have to do because everybody basically at 18, 19 is brought into the services. And he said, so before this, we should start it off. Basically, the disc that I was playing in was great. It was the top one in the area. But this one day, it burnt down. It was a thing called fashion, which is a particular type of time where they have all decorations up and everything. These decorations caught fire and the disco's burnt down. With it, some of my records, not all of them. And this guy came to me the very next day. He said, disco's burnt down. I know it has. And what about joining me now? Actually, somebody had already come to me from another disco, and so I had no problem with it. But this guy kept asking me, so I said, all right, come on, I'll go with you. Because I guess he felt, and people can feel, that he knew that I had some sort of interest. So I went to this agency where he was working for another agency, because what he wanted me to do was to see how the agencies worked, so we then open our own. And the manager there signed me up on the spot. He said, listen, you can work for us on the spot. I said, I can't do any nights. I'm working because I'm doing disco. But he saw the opportunities as well. And basically this role was as a house detective. Now in Germany, that's basically like a store detective, but you are the law. You are deputized. You arrest people. You write up the arrest papers. You send off the arrest papers to the Staatsanwalt, which is the district attorney. And then you take the case to court. And then you work very closely with the Kripo, which is German criminal police. I thought, well, let's see how this is like. So anyway, I did it. And I did it for a while, and it was very interesting. I got to know a lot of Germans and German police system and the courts. And I thought, this is fantastic, but I want to do something different. And so I went to the Americans and I said, this is me. I'm on offer. I'm a German speaker. And they said, great. And they ripped my arm off and said, listen, you could come into the military police any day. I said, no, I don't want to do that. So basically, they said, well, the Department of Defense takes on people as detectives for both the Army and the Air Force. And it's basically what they do is all of the facilities on both sets of bases, it's run by these detectives, and they work in tandem with American services and Germans when required and stuff like that. The boss, the guy who hired me, was an ex-FBI supervisory agent in the counterintelligence section. He'd done his time, 20-odd years. Great guy. It was he who basically said to me, if I were an Englishman, I'd be in the special branch. And the reason why, he'd been on a course in Scotland Yard Special Branch, because there's a lot of interconnection between services. And he said, but it was a fantastic course. He said, and these guys do all the stuff. They're like us in the FBI. He said, yeah, you've got your security service, but they're not police and have no police powers. These guys have got police powers. And I'd seen Special Branch on television, but he said, no, this is what to be. If I was an Englishman, I'd be in then. So that sort of put the seed in my mind. And that's how I applied for the branch and was later explained, that's not how it works, my friend. You cannot just join Special Branch. You have to join the Metropolitan Police. And then maybe, if you're lucky, you get there. And what they meant by that is the year I applied for the branch, you could only apply after 2 years because you have to do a probationary period. So after the 2 years probationary period and I applied, 1,300 people applied and they took 10 of us in. So each year there's only one application and the 10 of us who got through and I was one of the 10. So that's how it worked. So that was my run then through into other things.
It's such a process and it's such a story. It's incredible. What's the most unbelievable thing that's ever happened to you in the course of your career?
You're asking some questions here. So it's difficult to say because there are many things. And as I said before, I can't really talk about it. But again, two of the things that I put in the book, which I can talk about is, right, what happened is in 2003, 2004, after the invasion of Iraq, which is another thing I wrote a paper on, being against for exactly the same reasons. And by the way, Saddam had nothing to do with the Twin Towers at all. Indeed, Saddam was taking actions against Al-Qaeda and other jihadis because, of course, to them, he was an apostate. He was actually not really religious at all, but leaders utilise what they can to be leaders. So that's what it was about. So anyway, this happens, go to war. During the war, by this time I'd moved from SIS, from MI6, back to Special Branch, and I was in the protection section, which was A squad of Special Branch at the time. Later it changes. And I was running basically all of the operations element. So I put together a team to go into Iraq during the war before it ended, to go into Iraq to take a British minister there to divvy up the spoils of war. What you need to understand is war is all about what you get out of it in the end. Right. So the Axis obviously got themselves what they wanted to get out of it, and they called a big conference. And it was our point to try and get our minister there so we could get our piece of the pie of winning this war, or it was still in for B1, trying to win it. So there's a whole story around that, which I do say a little bit about in the book. But anyway, then for the next year, I set up a unit, which was basically a low infrastructure unit, which would go to places like that, Afghanistan, Iraq, Colombia, Yemen, extremely dangerous places, and take people, ministers, Secretary of State, Prime Minister, whomever, who need to go there. The British general in charge of the British forces, General Sir Freddie Figures, and AXO, that's the Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations, David Finesse, and the head of station in Baghdad, whose name obviously I can't give because the head of station is the head of SIS station. Obviously you can't give SIS officers' names. They basically, I was in a room one day, I was meeting up, getting all things together as I did, and I'd have to at some stage explain what a protection operation works. It's not just 5, 10, 20 blokes standing around somebody. There's a whole host of operational elements, intelligence that you need to work through.
So Carlton, who's the most important role model or mentor that you've had in your life?
I guess from the start, I'd say my mother and father. I explained about him a little bit, and my mother, how she in tandem worked as well and looked after us kids in a circumstance of the era. It couldn't have been easy. My mother was a nurse, and there's one story, and believe me, it's absolute truth. She was working there one day with one of her colleagues, and the colleague said, "Where do you keep it?" She said, "I don't understand." She said, "Your tail. Where do you keep it?" And this woman was serious. So that's the era. That's the era of reality. Not like it is what it is.
She wasn't even being rude.
Oh no, not being friendly, just asking, just sort of between us, where's it kept, sort of thing. So that's what you get. But so that's the era they were in, and that's what they were trying to do. It's just one of those things. Anyway, beyond those, when you're talking about in my profession, many various people, too many to mention.
That's incredible. I suppose family is the most formative influence you'll ever have in your life, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Those connections. So what's the best piece of advice that you've ever received in your life, in your career?
Right, so put it in the career. I mean, obviously, it's always do your best. That's a given. From one of my sort of mentors, the guy I told you about, the American, who was ex-counterintelligence supervisory special agent in the FBI. Typical American, superb advice he provided. He just said, CYA. I'm doing it in his accent. You know what that means, Carlton? You know what that means? CYA. Cover your ass. That's his advice. And I thought that was superb. Superb. He said, in this game, you got to cover your ass. Excuse my crudities, but I'm speaking as he spoke. So that is absolutely great advice, believe me. And another piece of advice that I got from one of my first Special Branch commanders, who, when I was on A Squad was the protection section of Special Branch, so I was a DC detective constable. We still have detective ranked in the branch, so it worked. And basically, he explained we were running I think it was the Home Secretary's team at the time. And he basically said, never call anybody sir. Call them by their title. You can still be respectful. And he explained it in this way. And I've always passed it on to people when I was a senior officer running people. You can't tell somebody to do something if they believe you are inferior to them and they're not going to take your advice. You've got to understand it this way. You're dealing with the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary. These are people who give orders to everybody. Now, when you're carrying out the role as a protection officer, which is what we call bodyguards, protection officer, and you say to that person, get down, they need to respond. You can't have them second guessing you. If you're calling them sir every 2 minutes or ma'am every 2 minutes, you've lost that. It's just not going to happen. And that goes in other walks of secret intelligence, by the way. You want people to believe that you know what you're talking about. So that's what it is. Now, of course, you call people in your organisation, be it the police or whatever, who are much senior to you, you're calling them sir and ma'am because that's just the way it is. And you can explain to them why they should do things or why they shouldn't. But the people that you're running, you don't work for them. You don't work for the Prime Minister. You don't work for the Home Secretary. You don't work for the President of the United States, if you're protecting the President of the United States. You work for the Metropolitan Police Service, Special Branch. Yeah, Scotland Yard, Special Branch. So those other people that you are providing a service to on behalf of government, and you need to control them.
Makes a hell of a lot of sense. If it's in their best interests as well, it's just a no-brainer really, isn't it? That's a great lesson. But if you could teach a college course on anything, what would you choose to teach?
I would teach true history, and that would incorporate the history of the African diaspora. Because you see, one of the problems we have in the world, in general, in geopolitics, is the fact that true history isn't taught. If I was said to you, and I used to do lectures at various phase, and I used to say to people, when did black people first come to Britain? And you get Windrush, 1948. And it's interesting that you hear it still all the time. You hear people saying, oh, the black people came after the Windrush in 48 to help build the country. They always show a newsreel, and the newsreel is Lord Kitchener singing a song, London is the place for me. You might have seen it, because they do it. Right. And the BBC reporter who's reporting that says, and he's cut class English accent of the BBC time, says, you're all ex-servicemen, aren't you? And people miss that out. So all these guys who are coming in 1948, they just haven't turned up then. As he says it, most of you are ex-servicemen, aren't you? Most of them were in the RAF, and most of them are going back to be in the RAF, or to be in the army, or to be back in the Navy. So during the war, these guys were fighting. But that's all forgotten, and it's to help us build the country after the war. Well, hang on, what were they doing in the war? And in the First World War before that, and in the Napoleonic Wars before that, because there's been blacks in Britain for 2,000 years. So that history I would get out. The other point is, I don't believe in race. I think it's a nonsense. I think it's an absolute biological nonsense. But it is a political reality. And that's what you've got to deal with, the political reality. 2,000 years ago, you had Emperor Septimus Severus, who was a black guy. Now, today, people may not want to call that guy black because of where he came from, because he was an emperor of Rome. Same way as they say to the Egyptian, oh, you're not black somehow. But if you look back in the time, that's what they are. You go to Egypt, and I've been many times, you can see the iconography. And if that but walked down the street, you'd say he's an IC3, which is what we call black people in the services. So it's a matter of reality. If he was in the United States, any of those Egyptians would not be able to sit at the lunch counter in the southern states in the 1960s and way before, 50s and 60s, 70s. So this is the reality of race. It's what people choose it to be, and it's who does the choosing. And it often isn't black people who do the choosing. In fact, it's never been. So I would get that correct history. You know, I mean, just to give you two more hits on that, and a funny one, actually. Alexandre Dumas, the great writer of The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers. His dad was a black guy from Haiti. He became a general in Napoleon's armies. There were 12 black generals in the Napoleon armies. He's the guy who actually carried out Napoleon's attack into Egypt and ran the battle on Egypt, and obviously fought against the Austrians and various others. And he was a well-known guy. But we play down their participation. And that's what I'm saying. And this is why it's important to understand the history.
It's an important lesson. It's a lot. You would definitely need a whole course for that. So yeah, hopefully you get that opportunity at some point.
I do talks.
So what is, Carlton, the most out-of-character thing that you have ever done?
That's an interesting question. And I'm going to answer it not with a cop-out, but with a sentiment. What is in character and what is out of character, I don't know. Especially in a duplicitous game like espionage is. I can't really say what is out of character or what is in character. I really can't realistically provide that information.
Fair enough. So what I want to know, we've touched on this a little bit earlier on in our conversation. What is the difference between MI5 and MI6?
Okay. In fact, I have to go further back and away from those two organisations dead quickly. Okay. In Britain, the first organisation that was a recognised intelligence and security organisation was the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. Read for that, Scotland Yard Special Branch. That was the first organisation formed in 1883 to defeat the Fenians. The Fenians were the Irish Brotherhood, and they wanted to pull away from the United Kingdom. Obviously, Ireland was run by the UK at the time, along with the rest of the empire, and they didn't want that. They wanted a free island, an Irish Free State, as they called it. And so they came into the mainland Britain and blew up a lot of places, including Old Scotland Yard. That's why you've got New Scotland Yard. And the task was given to the Special Irish Branch, that's what it was called, to defeat that. Well, they did defeat it, and basically the government thought this is a powerful body, great, we'll drop the sobriquet Irish and just call it the Special Branch. And at that stage, there was only this one Special Branch in Scotland Yard, and it carried out all political policing, which is basically secret police, on behalf of the United Kingdom, and actually into some of its colonies and so on and so forth. Right. Later, what happened is the guy who ran the organisation, a man by the name of Melville, had to retire after 30 years in the police. That's what you have to do. And so he wanted to carry on. So he lobbied government and suggested that there should be a secret service bureau in order that he could keep going. Without police powers, of course. So the Special Branch has police powers, and government said yes. And they called it MO first, Ministry of Intelligence, Secret Service Bureau. And it had MO3, MO5, MO9, MO6, various others. And that started in 1909, MI5, which is the Security Service, real name. And in 1911, they split off MI6, which is a Secret Intelligence Service, from that. So then there were other services with the MO and MIs, and they had some military elements to it as well, but they weren't military, they were civilians. As it's gone on, basically two exist, which is MI5, the Security Service, remains, and MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, remains. Now, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, for whom I worked as that James Bond role, is external to the United Kingdom. So basically, you are spying. You are carrying out operations outside of the UK, as a general rule. There's some internal elements, but generally outside. So you go to other countries and you try and find out what other countries do or are not doing. And in terms of terrorism, you try and work against terrorists around the world. MI5 is internal to the United Kingdom and carries out its actions in Great Britain, Northern Ireland, United Kingdom. Does that explain it?
Yeah, that does. So with that background, what is the impact that you most want to have on this planet now still?
Simple. Save lives. I believe I have saved lives, and I want to save lives. And I believe the work that I undertook has saved lives. Look, I understand in many ways why people are terrorists. Okay, because terrorism is a title. We can utilise that title anywhere. I understand why people want to fight the state. Sometimes the state leaves people little option but to seek their rights. And you could see that in South Africa. You could see that in some of the colonial struggles, in fact, you could see that in the United States and the way that people of colour were treated, particularly black people, due to the history of slavery in the United States. So you can see it gives people little option but to fight that system because you can be pushed too far. So understandable. Now, the thing is, oftentimes, however, it's not the case. Oftentimes, you could make that difference by negotiation. And that's my preference, because the problem is with conflict, when it begins, nobody knows where it ends. It's an unlimited and a very quick move towards, frankly, what I would call bestiality. It happens very quickly in conflict. You killed mine, so I'm going to kill yours, and you've killed it effectively. Yeah, I may appear less effectively, but I'm going to try and kill you in the same numbers. And this is what people need to understand. If we come back to that history again, we need to understand that. When you see people dying in Iraq, sometimes basically some of the weapons being used by coalition forces carrying out the war, the only thing you can do is clean people out with hose pipes because of how they've been killed with the ferocity of the weapons that we have as states. People are willing to drop nuclear bombs on people and kill millions of people. We were in a Cold War where people were willing to, and I don't think a lot of the youngsters understand this today. We had people in the 50s and 60s and then into 70s and 80s in a different way. You had people in the RAF, for example, just to take Britain, sitting in an aircraft 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, loaded with nuclear weapons, ready to take off within 3 minutes' notice. Okay, and when it took off, After you'd gone 20 minutes, you couldn't call it back. That's a recipe for disaster. So that's what we had. And all these people flying out were willing to kill millions of people, or were orientated to do that. Again, when we became more sophisticated, we put those weapons on nuclear submarines. One nuclear submarine had more than every bomb dropped in the Second World War, and indeed every war before it, and could kill multiple millions of people. So we were willing to do that, and we were also willing in an even worse way to fight proxy wars in other people's countries. So Vietnam, Angola, Zimbabwe, proxy wars, East-West, fighting each other over the issue of who's going to rule the world, but other people dying for it in their millions. So this is the problem that we've had to deal with, and it's politics that brings that problem to the fore.
It's quite dark, that, eh? Very good to be aware of. So tell me, with this show, this series of episodes that you're releasing, what do you think that people can expect to learn from your show that they wouldn't learn somewhere else?
This geopolitical understanding, the points I've just been making, to understand what they mean and to be circumspect with how they perceive fellow people in their own country and beyond. I'll put it this way. Just a basic thing, like the vast majority of refugees, example, are not in Britain, which is the propaganda you get, and not even in the European Union on the Isle of Lesbos or wherever. The vast majority of refugees in the poorest countries in the world, or relatively poor countries, who surround the countries where the refugees come from. So let's take South Africa. I can hear from your accent you're South African. So from the South Africa, you have got millions of refugees. Okay, Kenya has got millions of refugees. Turkey has got millions of refugees. Lebanon. That's where people are generally. The reality is that spending on refugees 9 times out of 10, or spending on aid budgets 9 times out of 10, has actually only progressed our economics. You tie your aid to the individuals having to buy your tractors, say. You see what I mean? So it's another way of selling. And also, it's assisting the bigger countries. So if you looked at it throughout the last 40, 50 years, biggest country getting aid would be the state of Israel. Then it would be Egypt. Then it would be latterly Afghanistan. But it's all military stuff to assist the conflict that's there. It's not necessarily humanitarian. Did you see what I'm saying? So it's an understanding of that that's important. It's an understanding of how your world works. Now, I know a lot of people don't want to know, but I'm hoping that people who listen to the program do want to know.
Absolutely. And for those people, how can they find out more about you, aside, of course, from listening to your podcast?
The easiest way, frankly, is to read my book, Black Ops, The Incredible True Story of a British Secret Agent. Now, that is available on Amazon and all good book systems, iTunes, whatever. It's available. And that's a good way of understanding my growing up and understanding how I think. Because what you need to understand is, in Britain, because we're a very strong class system, not in the police, but in the special branch, most people were middle class, some even upper middle class, have been to Harrow, various other places. Because what happens in this intelligence, this national security area, is it's controlled by those type of people. And definitely if you look at the other two agencies, MI5 I'll call it, and MI6, both of those two were middle class to ruling elite who were running those. GCHQ a little bit different because you needed to know how to work your computers or whatever else, so you had to take whomever's got the capacity. What happens with that is that people may not be attuned to how the normal person thinks and works. And as a working class and a black guy, I brought something different to the show. There definitely wasn't another black guy there when I was. I should explain. A case officer role was in those old days what you call the intelligence branch of SIS, of MI6. And it was effectively about a third of the organisation. Those are the people who had the task of getting agents, what we call agents informants, of carrying out operations, of working out operations. That was done by those people who were case officers like me. There's another 75% of the organisation, which job it was to assist you to do that, because every intelligence agency lives or dies by its agents. And by agents, that's informants. So you need them. But it is the most dangerous thing to do and the most politically dangerous thing to do. Because if you get caught politically, it's very bad. And in terrorism in particular, physically, it's going to be very bad for you because you're going to die a horrible death. And it's easier to understand if you are from a meagre background rather than from a very affluent background who've never had a real problem. Do you see what I mean? In the old days, that was okay because you're fighting the Soviet Union or whatever else. And it was the top dogs of the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact against our top dogs. But in this game of terror in particular, that's completely different.
That's powerful, very powerful. It's a marked difference, and it's wonderful that you could step into that role and take that on. And for me, I feel like I understand a little bit more about your frame of reference and your journey, and I'm really excited to hear these upcoming episodes as they go.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping it will be exciting for most people.
I'm absolutely sure it will be. Thank you, Carlton. That's all of my questions for today. It's been massively instructive. Very helpful.
Jeff, thanks very much for asking the questions. As a person who's actually been in the game, and we say a game, but it isn't, it's very difficult to understand what people from outside know, don't know, think what it might be about or might not be about. And so therefore, to actually have some questions from a layperson to allow me then to articulate how I think and others generally think on these issues has been of the utmost importance. I think that this episode sets a superb grounding for the future episodes where I'll be delving much deeper. And also, we're going to have some fantastic shows where our listeners are able just to phone in to ask any question they want related to the area. And I'll just answer as much and as best I can. And I look forward to everybody listening in the future. Thank you very much.
Carlton King is a real-life working-class spy, bringing you the details, the stories, and secrets from his life spent spying. Give us a 5-star rating on Apple iTunes, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of the excitement. This is for your ears only.
My name's Carlton King, and I'm an ex-spy.
This podcast was produced by a podcast company. If you need help with your podcast, simply visit apodcastcompany.com or email Jason at apodcastcompany.com.